He slammed his fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled off the edge and shattered across the floor. Elena didn't flinch. She had learned, long ago, that flinching only made it worse. "You think you can just leave?" Silas Whitlock's voice was the kind of low that was worse than screaming. He stepped around the table slowly, the way a man does when he wants you to understand there's nowhere to run. "You belong to this family. Every acre of that land belongs to us. And you," he grabbed her wrist before she could step back, "you belong to us too." She looked him dead in the eye and said nothing. That silence, that one moment of refusing to break, would cost her everything she had left. And somehow, it would also save her life. If someone had done this to you, taken everything, convinced an entire community to look the other way, and then come hunting you down when you finally dared to breathe free, what would you do? Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. And drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Elena's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach was 2 hours late, which gave Thorne Mercer plenty of time to regret agreeing to any of this. He stood at the edge of the road with his hat in his hands, turning it in slow circles the way he always did when he didn't know what else to do with himself. The cold had already found its way past his collar. The sky above Granite Ridge was the particular gray of a sky that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to snow or just threaten to for the rest of the day. Either way, it matched his mood perfectly. The other men who'd come down from the mountain for supply runs had long since finished their business and ridden back. The general store owner, a heavy-set man named Caldwell, had offered Thorne a chair inside twice already. Twice Thorne had declined. Standing felt more honest. If he sat down and got comfortable, he might actually start thinking this was a normal thing he was doing. It wasn't. 39 years old, and he was waiting on a woman he'd never met, who'd agreed to marry him through letters, because some agency in a city he'd never been to had matched their names on a piece of paper. He had filled out this form 2 winters ago when the isolation had gotten bad enough that he'd started talking to the horses not just for company, but because he'd expected them to answer back. His friend Doyle had been the one to suggest it. "You're not made to live alone, Thorne. Nobody is." Doyle had meant it kindly. Thorne had resisted for another 8 months before the silence finally broke him. The letters had started slowly. Her name was Elena Whitlock, widow. She wrote in clean, careful sentences that told him practical things. She could cook. She understood livestock. She wasn't afraid of hard winters. What she didn't write was just as obvious to him. There was nothing personal, nothing soft. No mention of what she liked, what she missed, what made her laugh. He had told himself that some people were simply private. He had told himself that practical was fine, practical was good. He lived a practical life. But something in those letters had sat uneasy with him, and standing here now, head still turning in his hands, he was starting to understand that maybe the unease had been trying to tell him something. The sound of the stagecoach reached him before it rounded the bend. The horses looked exhausted. The driver looked worse. 3 passengers climbed out. A heavy-set merchant who immediately started arguing with the driver about his luggage, a young man who moved fast and didn't make eye contact with anyone, and then, last, a woman who stepped down slowly, one hand on the doorframe, and stood very still for a moment before she moved. She was smaller than he'd expected. That was the first thing. Not frail, she held herself like someone who'd carried weight for a long time and had simply gotten used to it, but smaller. Her dress was dark, practical, worn to the kind of softness that comes from too many washings. She carried a single carpet bag. She scanned the road in both directions before she did anything else, and the speed of that scan, the practiced efficiency of it, went straight through Thorne like cold water. That wasn't nerves. He knew nerves. Nerves was fidgeting and looking at your feet. What she did was something older and more careful than nerves. He raised his hand. "Miss Whitlock?" She found him fast. Too fast. Like she'd already placed everyone on this road before she stepped off the coach and had simply been waiting to confirm. She walked toward him with her chin level and her carpet bag held in both hands in front of her, and when she stopped a few feet away, she looked at him the way someone looks at a door they're not sure they should open. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was steady, quiet. "Thorne." He put his hand out. She looked at his hand for just a second before she shook it. Her grip was firm, brief. She let go quickly. He thought about saying something easy and reassuring. He thought about telling her she didn't need to worry, that the trip up the mountain wasn't so bad, that the cabin was warmer than it looked. He thought about a lot of things, and then he decided none of them were worth saying, so instead he just said, "The wagon's around the side. I've got supplies to load first if you don't mind waiting." "I don't mind," she said. He nodded and went to deal with Caldwell and the crates, and he didn't look back at her for a while because it felt like looking back might spook her, the same way looking directly at a deer will make it bolt before you've even moved your feet. When he came back, she was standing in the exact same spot. She hadn't sat on this bench outside the store. She hadn't looked in any of the windows. She had stood in one place where she could see both ends of the road, and she had waited. Thorne loaded the last crate himself and then gestured toward the wagon. She climbed up without help or comment. He took the seat beside her and clicked the horses forward, and they started the long haul up toward Granite Ridge in silence. The silence lasted almost an hour. He didn't try to fill it. He knew how to be quiet. You had to. Out here. But this silence was different from the comfortable kind. It had weight. He could feel her sitting at the exact edge of the seat, not relaxed against the backboard, just perched there with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead. About halfway up, a branch cracked somewhere in the trees on her side. She grabbed the edge of the seat so hard her knuckles whitened. Then she breathed, released it, and went back to looking at the road. Thorne kept his eyes forward. "Elk," he said. "They bed down in those trees through the afternoon." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "How far up is the cabin?" "Another hour, give or take." She nodded. He watched her shoulders drop, just slightly. Not relaxed, more like someone adjusting to a weight they'd already decided they had to carry. He wanted to ask her something. He wasn't sure what. He couldn't ask the real question, "What happened to you?" So he said the only thing that felt honest. "I should probably tell you something before we get there." She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd gotten on the wagon. "I wrote that I was looking for a wife," he said, "and I meant that, but I don't need anything from you before you're ready to give it." He kept his eyes on the horses. "I've got 2 rooms. I fixed up the back one. It locks from the inside. That's yours, however long you want it." The quiet stretched out between them. "The agency didn't say anything about separate rooms," she said finally. Her voice was careful. Testing. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." Another silence. Then she said, in a voice stripped down to almost nothing, "Why?" He thought about it. "I don't know exactly. You just seemed like someone who needed to know that before you got to the top of this mountain." She turned back to the road. He didn't try to read her expression. He just let the horses keep walking, and the wind keep moving through the pines, and the afternoon keep going wherever afternoons went out here in the wilderness. When the cabin finally came into view, low, solid, built to hold against winter, she made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. He wasn't sure if it was relief or dread or something in between. He stopped the wagon and climbed down and started untying the supply crates because that was what needed doing. She sat up on the seat for a moment before she got down, and he heard her feet hit the ground, and then he heard nothing for a few seconds. He turned to find her standing a few feet from the front door, looking at the cabin. Not the way someone looks at something new, the way someone looks at something they're trying to figure out if they can trust. "Go ahead inside," he said. "I'll get the animals squared away." She looked at him once more, that direct, measuring look. And then she went inside. He stood there in the cold for a moment after the door closed, his hands full of rope he wasn't doing anything with. The elk had moved off somewhere in the trees. The sky was doing that thing where it turned a particular shade of purple-gray that meant the temperature was about to drop hard. He thought about her face when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, the way she'd scanned the road, the way she'd grabbed the wagon seat at the sound of a branch, the way she'd looked at his outstretched hand before she'd decided to take it. He thought about the bruises he hadn't seen yet, but already understood were there. He put the rope away, gathered the horses, and got to work. Inside the cabin, Elena stood in the middle of the main room and did what she always did when she entered any new space. She counted the exits. Front door, 1 window left, 1 right. Back room. She could see the door standing open from here. Small, but a door. She walked to it, tried the handle, found the iron bolt on the inside, still stiff and new. She slid it open, then closed, then open again, testing the weight of it. It held. She sat down on the edge of the cot and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and focused on breathing until the tightness in her chest started to ease. The walls were log, thick enough to be solid. The floor had no gaps she could see. There was a small stove in the corner with a pipe that ran up through the roof and a stack of cut wood beside it. Someone had put a wool blanket on the cot. It wasn't new, but it was clean. She didn't cry. She was past the age when she cried easily. But something loosened in her chest that she didn't have a name for. A man she didn't know had looked at her on a wagon seat and understood something about her that she had not said out loud. And instead of pushing her, or explaining what she owed him, or making her feel small for needing distance, he had simply told her the room locked from the inside. She didn't trust it. She had learned not to trust easy things, but she noted it. Outside, the temperature dropped another 5 degrees, and the wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in the late afternoon. Thorn got the horses into the small stable, laid down fresh straw, made sure the water hadn't frozen yet, and then stood for a moment in the quiet of the animal smell and the sound of the horses breathing. He was not a man who spent much time on feelings. The mountains didn't reward that. But something had shifted on that wagon ride, something in the way he'd understood, bone deep, that he had no idea what this woman had come from, and that whatever it was, it had tried very hard to unmake her. He thought about what he'd said. "That's yours, however long you want it." He meant it. He just hoped he meant it as much when things got harder, as he did now, standing in the warmth of the stable with his horses. Then he went inside to start dinner, because that was what came next. She was sitting at the table when he came in. She'd found the plates without being asked. She'd put them out, 2 of them, set even, 1 on each side. He looked at that for a second. Such a small thing. He said nothing about it. He put water on to boil and started with the salt pork because it was what he had, and it was hearty enough for the cold. She watched him work for a few minutes, and then got up without asking and started slicing the bread he'd brought up from town that morning. He let her. He didn't tell her she didn't have to. He could see she needed to be useful. They ate with the fire going and the wind building outside, and between bites she asked him questions, practical questions. How often did he go to town? What the winters were like? Whether the well froze? What the livestock situation was? He answered each one directly, no elaboration, and she nodded and asked the next one. And it was more like an inventory than a conversation, but it was real, and he found he didn't mind it. "You're checking whether you can manage alone if something happens to me," he said, not unkindly. She looked up from her plate. Something moved behind her eyes. "That's a fair thing to check," he said, and went back to eating. She was quiet for the rest of the meal, but when she got up to clear the plates, he noticed she didn't hold herself quite so far from the edge of the room. She moved a little more easily in the space. Not comfortable, but less like she was calculating the distance to the door every 30 seconds. He counted that as something. Later, when the fire had burned down low, and he'd said goodnight and she'd disappeared behind that back door, he heard the bolt slide home, clean and firm. He sat for a while in the dim light of the main room, listening to the wind. He thought about the letters she'd written, practical and careful and absent of anything soft. He thought about the practiced way she'd looked up and down that road. He thought about the bruises he hadn't seen yet. He thought, whatever she's carrying, she's been carrying it a long time. And then he thought, you've got time. Don't rush it. Just be steady. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall on Granite Ridge, quiet, indifferent, covering everything without asking anything from anyone. And in the back room of a mountain cabin at the edge of the wilderness, a woman who had spent years making herself invisible lay awake in the dark with her hand pressed flat against a locked door, breathing slowly, counting the sounds of a new place, trying to decide if she was allowed to believe this one might be different. She wasn't sure yet, but the bolt held, and for tonight, that was enough. The snow that fell that first night didn't stick. By morning, it had turned to a thin frost that coated the grass and the fence posts and the top rail of the small corral out back. And Elena was already outside when Thorn woke up, moving along the fence line with a bucket in one hand and a piece of wire in the other, checking each post the way someone checks a wound. Systematic, unhurried, looking for what's weak before it fails. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. She was wearing her dark dress and a coat that was too thin for the altitude, and her breath came out in small clouds in the cold air, But she was moving with the kind of focus that made you understand she wasn't cold in any way that was going to slow her down. He went back inside and put coffee on. When she came in 20 minutes later, she set the wire down on the workbench by the door and washed her hands at the basin without being asked, without looking around to figure out where things were. She'd already figured that out the night before, he suspected, the same way she'd figured out the plates and the bread knife and the bolt on the back room door. 2 posts on the north side need resetting, she said. The wire's only surface rusted. It'll hold through winter if you reinforce the posts before the ground freezes solid. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table. I was going to get to those last month. I know, she said. And then she seemed to catch herself, like she wasn't sure if that had been too blunt. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the steam coming off it. You're right, he said. I kept putting it off. She relaxed, barely. Just a fraction. But he was learning to read fractions. That was how the first 2 weeks went. She worked. He worked. They ate together and talked mostly about the practical business of the homestead, what needed fixing, what supplies were running low, what the weather was likely to do. She was good at weather. Better than him, honestly. She'd look at the sky for a minute and tell him whether they had 2 days or 4 before the next storm. With a reliability that bothered him until he understood she'd probably spent years reading every signal available to her because her safety had depended on reading things accurately. She moved through the cabin and the yard like someone who had made a decision about where she stood in relation to everything and wasn't going to revise it unnecessarily. She wasn't timid. That was the wrong word for her. She was controlled. There was a difference, and it took him a little while to feel it, but once he felt it, he couldn't unfeel it. The timid people he'd known in his life had been apologetic about taking up space. Elena didn't apologize for anything. She just made herself small in a different way. She kept her movements precise, her voice low, her requests non-existent. She didn't ask for things. She located what she needed and obtained it herself, or she did without. He started leaving things out. An extra blanket on the chair, a heavier coat on the peg by the door, the good knife on the workbench instead of the drawer. And she used them without comment, which he took as the closest thing to gratitude she currently knew how to express. She was not easy company. He wanted to be honest with himself about that. There were evenings when the silence between them had a quality that felt like pressure, like being in a room where someone had been arguing before you walked in and hadn't quite finished. She would sit by the fire with a piece of mending or with nothing at all, and she would be somewhere inside herself that he couldn't reach and hadn't been invited to, and he would sit on the other side of the fire with his pipe or his own thoughts, and they would pass the evening that way, 2 people orbiting the same warmth without touching. He didn't push. Not because he didn't want to, because he could see that pushing was exactly what she was waiting for him to do. 3 weeks in, she fixed the fence posts herself. He came back from checking the trap lines to find them already sunk and packed and braced, the wire retightened, the whole north run solid. She was coiling the leftover wire when he walked up. He looked at the work. It was done right. Better than he would have done it, probably, because she'd used the small wedge stones around the base the way the old mountain homesteaders did, a technique he'd known about but never bothered with. You've built fence before, he said. Plenty of times. He waited, but she didn't add anything. He nodded at the work. That's going to hold. It should, she said. He picked up the extra tools and carried them back to the stable and didn't say anything else about it. But that night at dinner, he told her he'd been meaning to re-chink the south wall before the heavy snows came, and he was behind on it, and she said she knew how to do chinking and she'd get to it tomorrow if he left her the lime mix. He left it. She got to it. By the end of the first month, she had repaired things he hadn't asked her to, organized the supply shelves in an order that made more sense than what he'd had, learned the names and temperaments of all 3 horses, and started keeping a notebook on the workbench where she tracked what supplies they'd used and what they'd need before the mountain road became impassable. He had never lived with anyone who was competent the way she was competent. It was a particular kind of competence, practical, quiet, always a little ahead of the problem. It should have made him feel useful. It mostly made him feel like he'd been doing everything slightly wrong for years and hadn't known it. But there was the other side of it, the side that came out in moments and then closed off fast, like a door catching on a warped frame. The morning she dropped the cast iron skillet and it hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot, she was pressed against the far wall before Thorne had even registered what happened. He looked up from the fire to find her there, back flat against the logs, hands up near her shoulders, chest going fast. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they're not quite in the room with you anymore. He picked the skillet up off the floor and set it on the stove and said, "Good morning to you too," in a voice that was so deliberately ordinary it was almost awkward. She blinked, came back, looked at him. "Skillet slipped," he said. "They do that when the handle's worn. I'll fix it." She pushed off the wall and tucked her hair back and said, "I'll make the eggs," in a voice that didn't shake, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't for him. He sat with that image for days afterward. The way she'd moved to the wall, not running, not scrambling, pressing herself back, making herself a smaller target. That was a practiced response. That was something a person's body learned over time, through repetition. He thought about that and felt something settle into anger low in his chest that he kept very quiet because he understood that anger, pointed in the wrong direction at the wrong time, was going to be the thing that damaged whatever small, careful thing was beginning to grow here. He fixed the skillet handle that afternoon. She noticed and didn't say anything, but she held it differently after that, more comfortably, and he noticed that. The nightmares started in the second month, or at least that was when he first heard them. A sound from the back room. Not screaming, nothing that dramatic. More like someone talking in urgent whispers, or the sound of someone trying to get up from somewhere they weren't sure they could rise from. He'd lie still in the main room and listen until it stopped, which it always did, usually within a few minutes, replaced by the sound of the bolt sliding open and then closed again, and then quiet. He never mentioned it. He couldn't think of what he'd say. "I heard you having a nightmare." That was an invasion she hadn't invited. So he said nothing, and in the morning she came out to the table looking like someone who'd been awake for part of the night but was going to deal with that privately, and he poured her coffee, and they talked about the horses or the weather or the fence, and it was its own kind of kindness, maybe, letting her have that. Then came the afternoon with the sleeve. He'd been splitting wood in the yard, a long job, monotonous, the kind that let your mind empty out, and she'd been mending tack in the stable doorway where the light was better. His axe head had come slightly loose over the course of the afternoon, and he'd come into the stable to find the small hammer, and she'd had her left sleeve pushed up past the elbow for some reason, reaching for something on the high shelf, and he saw them. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't notice him immediately. He had a clear 2 seconds before she turned and registered him standing there, and in those 2 seconds he looked at the inside of her forearm. The marks were not fresh. They were the particular yellow-brown of bruises that were weeks old, layered over marks that were older still. A different color, a different stage. Not from one incident, from many. She turned and saw him, and her arm came down and her sleeve came down, and she looked at him with her jaw set and her eyes steady and utterly unreadable. He found the hammer on the low shelf where it always was. He picked it up. He looked at it like he was checking the weight. "I need to tighten the axe head," he said. He walked back outside. His hands were not steady when he got back to the splitting stump. He set the hammer down and stood still for a moment with his back to the stable. It was not a man who showed things on his face easily. The mountains had taken that, or maybe he'd come here already missing it. But something was moving through him right now that was too big and too hot to be organized quickly into anything useful. He breathed through it. Then he picked up the hammer, tightened the axe head, and went back to splitting wood. An hour later, she brought him a cup of water out to the yard. She just held it out without saying anything, and he took it, and they stood there in the cold afternoon light, and she said, "I'm not going to talk about it." "Okay," he said. "Not yet." He looked at her. She was looking somewhere past his shoulder. Her chin was up. That particular angle he'd learned meant she was keeping herself together by an act of will. "I'm not asking," he said. I won't ask. You tell me when you're ready, if you're ever ready." He handed the cup back. "There's no obligation." She looked at him then. Directly, the way she rarely did. The way that felt like being assessed by someone who had very good reasons to assess carefully. She nodded once, short, sharp, and went back inside. That night he heard her bolt the door, and then, a little later, the sound of something he hadn't heard from the back room before. Not a nightmare. More like the sound of someone simply sitting in the dark, breathing, just breathing, like they were practicing it. November arrived with real intention. The temperatures dropped to places that made even the horses bad-tempered, and the work shifted. More time keeping things from freezing, more time managing the woodpile. More time inside the cabin where the air between two people who didn't know each other well enough yet got complicated in ways that outdoor work usually kept from building up. She handled close quarters better than he expected, actually. She had a way of calibrating distance that was almost architectural. She always knew how far she was from him, always left enough space, never let herself be in a position where she couldn't move freely. He'd noticed it from the beginning, but now, inside, it was clearer. She'd be at the stove, and if he needed something from the shelf behind her, she'd step aside before he asked. Smooth and immediate. And sometimes she stepped a little farther than necessary, and he understood that the extra distance wasn't about the shelf. He learned to announce himself. Coming in from outside, he'd say something. A cough, a word about the weather, anything. Before the door fully opened, so she'd know it was him. He didn't explain why he was doing it. She didn't ask. But after a week, he noticed she didn't go quite so rigid when the door opened, and he counted that as progress. He was careful about anger around her. Not that he'd been a volatile man before. He'd grown up around people who confused noise with power, and he'd decided early he wasn't going to be that. But now he was more deliberate. If something frustrated him, he walked it off. He didn't slam things. He didn't speak in a particular way. He watched himself the way he imagined she was watching him, and he tried to be something predictable, something steady, because he understood that predictability was probably the rarest thing she'd had in a very long time. It was working, slowly. She started saying more. Not about herself, not yet, but just more. She'd comment on something out the window or ask a question that was slightly less practical than usual. One evening she told him, unprompted, that she'd grown up in Pennsylvania and that the winters here were different from the winters there. Heavier, she said, but cleaner. Like the cold here meant something. Like it was honest about what it was, instead of just gray. He thought that was the most revealing thing she'd said since she'd arrived, and it had nothing to do with her past at all. He told her about his own people. Not a lot. He didn't have a lot to tell that didn't end in the particular sadness of people gone before their time. His mother when he was 12, a winter fever. His father another 6 years after that, slowly and less cleanly. A brother somewhere east he hadn't spoken to in a decade, not from any drama, just from the kind of distance that grows between people when they stop making the effort, and then one day realize the gap has gotten too wide to cross without acknowledging it. He told it plain, without self-pity, the way he would have told anyone, and she listened without making the sounds people usually made to show they were listening. She just listened. "You came up here after your father?" she asked. "Before," he said. "I came up here because I needed something that wasn't going anywhere." She thought about that for a while. "The mountains." "The mountains don't leave," he said. "They don't change their minds. They're just what they are." She looked at the fire. "I used to think I needed people to be more like mountains," she said. "Now I think I just needed to find people who had some mountain in them." He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he said nothing, and she seemed fine with nothing, and they sat by the fire until the wood burned down to coals. It was the first week of December when she told him the first real thing. She told it the way she did most things, practical, facing forward, not looking at him. They were at the table after dinner, and she'd been quieter than usual all day, and he'd figured it was one of those days that had weight to it for reasons he wasn't going to know, and then she just started talking. She said that her late husband's name had been Martin Whitlock. She said she had married him when she was 23 because her family had thought it was a good match. He had land, he had standing, he was well regarded in the church community and in the town. She said that the man she'd seen in the months before the wedding was not the same man she'd been living with before his death. She said this plainly, without drama, like she was giving a report. But her hands were flat on the table and very still, and he knew by now that was what she did when she was keeping herself together. She didn't detail things. She didn't need to. She used words like controlled and managed and corrected, and she said them in a voice that had been sanded down to almost nothing, and he sat still across from her and kept his face as neutral as he could manage, which took more effort than anything he could remember doing in recent years. She said the community, the congregation, the elders, the neighbors, had known. She said that wasn't a conclusion she'd come to angrily after the fact. She'd seen it, clearly and for years, in the way people looked through her at church, in the way her husband's friends joked in front of her about wives who needed to learn their place, in the way women had taken her hands and said, "We'll pray for you," instead of "Let's get you out." That was the part that broke something in her voice. Just briefly, she caught it fast. "They chose him," she said. Every time. They chose him. Thorne said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry." She shook her head, not dismissing his words, but not accepting them either. "He died in the fall 2 years ago. Heart," the doctor said. She paused. "I didn't grieve the way I was supposed to. I noticed that about myself." "There's no supposed to," he said. "The community thought there was." She looked at the table. "They watched me very carefully for a while afterward." He waited. "Before he died," she said, "I found documents. Land records. Property that had been in my family before the marriage. My grandfather's farmland, which came to me through my mother. Martin had filed paperwork claiming it as his, under a provision in the county records that allowed a husband to consolidate marital property without his wife's direct signature if 2 witnesses from the congregation signed the transfer. She said this in a voice so stripped of emotion it was almost clinical. He had 2 willing witnesses, of course. "Those documents were falsified," Thorne said. "Yes, and I had the originals, the deed in my name from before the marriage, and letters from my grandfather that made the chain of ownership clear." She looked up at him finally. "I found them in a box he thought I didn't know about. I kept copies of everything. I kept them separate in places he didn't check." Thorne thought about what that meant. The planning required. The patience. The fear of what happened if she was found out. "Martin's brother," she said. "Silas. He knows the documents exist. He knows I have them." Her voice went a fraction flatter, which he'd learned was how she expressed something that frightened her. "He's not the kind of man who lets things go." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "How long before he comes looking?" She met his eyes. "I don't know. I thought the distance would slow him down. But Silas is patient. He's more patient than Martin was, and smarter about how he shows it." Something settled in Thorne's chest then. Not fear exactly, but a kind of settling into gravity, the way you feel when a problem that was abstract becomes concrete and close. He looked at this woman across his table and understood that she had come here not just because she was desperate, and not just because she was brave, but because she was both of those things, and also strategizing, always thinking 2 moves ahead. "The documents are safe," he said. "They're safe." "Where?" She looked at him for a moment with that measuring look. Then she said, "Not yet." He nodded. "Fair enough." She got up and cleared the plates, and he let her, and when she went to the back room, he heard the bolt slide home the way it always did. But that night, there were no sounds from behind that door, no whispered nightmares, no restless movement, just quiet. He sat in the main room for a while after, looking at the fire. He thought about a man named Martin Whitlock, who had spent years turning a capable, intelligent woman into someone who measured every room by its exits, who pressed herself to walls when loud sounds came, who bolted her door in a house full of kindness because kindness had never come without a price. He sat with the anger of that for a long time. Then he banked the fire, because it was what needed doing, and he went to sleep. But the anger didn't go anywhere. It just settled in, the way cold settles in when a season changes. Quiet, pervasive. There when you checked for it, and there when you didn't. He carried it carefully, like a lamp in wind, because he understood that fury without direction only burned the person holding it, and he was going to need to stay clear. Because somewhere east of the Granite Ridge, a patient man named Silas Whitlock was doing what patient men do, waiting for the right moment, planning the shape of what came next, and moving, inch by inch, in the direction of a mountain he hadn't been to yet. The days after that dinner conversation had a different quality to them. Not easier, exactly. Nothing about Granite Ridge in December was easy, but different. Like the air pressure had shifted slightly, the way it does before a storm breaks, and you realize the heaviness you'd been feeling for days wasn't just weather. Elena didn't bring up what she'd told him again. She went back to the fence work, the supply tracking, the animals, all of it, as if the conversation had been a practical matter she'd needed to get through and now it was done. Thorne didn't push. He'd promised he wouldn't, and he kept promises with the same stubbornness he kept everything, quietly, without announcement. But something between them had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. You can't tell a person the shape of your worst years and then go back to talking about weather and fence posts and have it be exactly the same as before. The fence posts were still fence posts, the weather was still the weather. But the silence that lived between those conversations was different now. Less guarded, Still not comfortable. She might never be fully comfortable. He was starting to understand that. But different in a way, he noticed, and was careful not to press on. She started asking him things that weren't about the homestead. Small things. At first, she asked him once what he thought about the territory, whether he thought it would become a proper state in his lifetime. He gave her his honest opinion, which was that he didn't much care either way as long as they left the mountain alone, and she made a sound that was almost amusement and said that was about the most mountain man answer he could have given. He said he was about the most mountain man person she was going to find, and she looked at him with that measuring look and said, yes, she was beginning to see that. And then she went back to her work. But he held on to that moment for a while after, because it was the closest thing to easy she'd been in his company, and he understood it for what it was. The cold deepened into the second week of December, and the snow that had been threatening finally committed itself. It started on a Tuesday. He remembered because he'd been planning to go down to Caldwell's for lamp oil, and it became immediately clear that wasn't happening. And it came down in the serious way that mountain snow came down. Not decorative, not gentle, just committed and heavy, and building up fast enough that by mid-afternoon the corral fence had disappeared under 2 feet of white. He got the animals settled and extra fed before dark, and he came in to find Elena at the stove, not making dinner yet, just standing there with her arms crossed and her eyes on the window where the snow was pressing against the glass like something trying to get in. "We're going to be here a while," he said, stomping the snow off his boots at the door. "I know." Her voice was neutral, but there was something under it that he'd learned to recognize, the particular flatness that meant she was managing something she didn't want to show. He hung his coat and came to the fire and held his hands out to it. "How much lamp oil we have?" "Enough for 2 weeks if we're careful," she said. "I checked yesterday." He nodded. He'd known she would have checked. He'd checked too. And their numbers matched, which was its own kind of thing. 2 people arriving at the same careful number independently, without discussing it first. "I'm not going anywhere," she said abruptly. Then she seemed to hear how that sounded, and added, quieter, I'm not. The snow doesn't bother me. Closed in doesn't bother me." "Okay," he said. "I just wanted to say that." "All right." She uncrossed her arms and went back to the stove and started with dinner, and he went to deal with the firewood situation, and they let the moment be what it was. What she'd meant, he understood, was that she wasn't going to panic. She was telling him in advance, in her particular way of never asking for accommodation and never admitting she needed it, that she'd been in small spaces before when the world outside was dangerous, and she knew how to be inside her own head without it eating her alive. She was telling him he didn't need to manage her. He appreciated that. He also appreciated that she'd felt the need to say it at all, which meant some part of her was aware that the closed-in days were harder, and that awareness, that sliver of acknowledgement, was more than she'd given him 2 weeks ago. The storm built through the night. By morning it was a full whiteout, the kind that makes the world beyond 10 feet into a gray nothing, and the temperature had dropped to somewhere that made the wood in the cabin walls crack in the early hours like something trying to escape. He got up at 4 to stoke the fire because if it went out, they'd be in real trouble, and he moved as quietly as he could. But when he turned from the fireplace, she was already sitting up in the doorway of the back room, wrapped in the wool blanket, watching him. They looked at each other across the dim room. "Loud," she said. He understood she meant the wood cracking. "Old cabin," he said. "It does that when it drops fast." She nodded. She stayed in the doorway for a minute longer, and he turned back to the fire and gave her time, and when he looked back, she'd gone back to her room. But the bolt didn't slide home. He noticed that. He didn't know what to do with it, so he just sat by the fire for another few minutes until he was sure the heat had caught, and then he went back to his own bed. By day 2 of the storm, they had settled into a rhythm. She kept the inside, managing the food, keeping the water supply from freezing at the indoor barrel, maintaining the lamp oil carefully. He kept making trips out to the stable, shorter trips, more frequently, to keep the animals from getting dangerously cold. The wind was the kind that came straight off the ridge and hit you like a physical thing, and he came back in from every trip with ice on his beard and a few more minutes less inside him somewhere. She had coffee ready every time he came in. She didn't say anything about it, just had it there. He drank it and went back out. On the 3rd day, the wind dropped enough that the snow fell straight instead of sideways, which was an improvement in the way that getting hit once instead of repeatedly is an improvement. He came in from the midday stable check, and she was sitting at the table with her notebook. Not the supply notebook, a different one, smaller, that he'd seen her writing in sometimes in the evenings, but had never asked about, and she closed it when he came in. Not fast. Not the way a person hides something. Just closed it, the way you close a thing when you're done with it for now. "What are you writing?" he asked, because it felt like a question he was allowed now, after everything. She looked at the notebook for a moment. "Things I need to remember," she said. "Things I need to say at some point. To someone official." He sat down across from her. "For the land claim." "For the land claim. And other things." She put her hand flat on the cover. "There's a doctor. Back in Hester County, where I lived. He examined me twice, once after a bad winter, once the following spring. He wrote down what he saw." She paused. "I have copies of what he wrote." Thorne was very still. "He's an honest man," she said. "One of the few who was. He told me at the time that he would testify to what he documented if I ever needed him to. He was afraid to say it any louder than that, but he said it." Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken once through any of this, and he was beginning to understand that the control wasn't hardness. It was the opposite of hardness. It was the thing that had kept her intact when everything else was being taken apart. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been building a case for 2 years," she said. "Before he died, during, after. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it. I just knew I was going to need it." Outside, the snow fell quiet and straight. Inside, the fire moved in the grate. I thought about a 23-year-old woman who had walked into a marriage and figured out within a year, probably less, that no one was coming for her, that the community around her had made its choice, and had started building something privately in the only space she still had, the space inside her own mind. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "The man you were before you married him," he said, and then he stopped because he had it wrong, and he knew it. "The person. Who you were before." "I know what you mean," she said. "Is she still in there?" She thought about it for a long time, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I think she's who's been doing all the planning." He nodded. She stood up and put the notebook in her coat pocket and went to check on the water barrel, and he sat at the table for a while and thought about that. About a woman who had kept the most essential version of herself buried deep enough that no one had been able to get at it, and had spent years quietly gathering everything she needed to eventually get herself free. He thought he had been lonely before she arrived. He thought he hadn't known what kind of house he'd built up here. A practical one, a survivable one, but a house without any of the furniture of real life in it. He thought about Doyle telling him, "You're not made to live alone," and he thought Doyle hadn't been wrong, but Doyle also hadn't known what it would actually look like when it arrived. It didn't look like what he'd expected. That was true. It was better and harder and more real than what he'd expected. That evening, she made biscuits from the last of the good flour, and they ate them with the salt pork and the dried beans that were getting monotonous but were still hot and filling, and somewhere in the middle of dinner she said without preamble, "The bruises you saw." He set his fork down. "I know you saw them," she said. "I know you didn't say anything. I want to tell you that I noticed you didn't say anything, and I want to tell you what they were from." "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't." She looked at her plate. "That's why I'm doing it." He waited. "The last winter," she said, "before he died in the fall. He was worse that year. I don't know why. I stopped trying to find reasons because the reasons didn't matter. What mattered was learning when it was coming and where to be when it did." She said this with the same clinical flatness she used when she was working through a hard problem, and he kept his own face still and his hands still and let her talk. "Most of what you saw was from February. I fell wrong on the stairs once, and that one left marks for almost 2 months. The others they were what they were." He was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. The same words he'd said before, and he knew they were insufficient, and he said them anyway because they were true. "I know," she said. She looked up at him. "The doctor who documented it, he wrote in his notes that the pattern and nature of the injuries were, quote, inconsistent with accidental causes." She almost smiled, a brittle thing, not quite humor. He was careful with his language. He was afraid of the community too, but he wrote it down, and it's there. And if Silas comes up here thinking he's going to pressure me back into whatever legal box he's built for me, he's going to find out that I have spent 2 years making sure he can't. There it was. The thing he'd been watching for without knowing he was watching for it, the core of her, the part that had kept building in the dark when everything else was being beaten down. Not bravado, not performance, just the absolutely flat certainty of someone who had done the work and was done being afraid of the result. "He will come," she said. "I want you to know that. I didn't come here to put your home in the middle of something without telling you what it was." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now." "I understand." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not angry." "Not at you," he said. She seemed to sit with that for a moment. Then she said, "Most men would be angry at the complication." "I'm not most men," he said. It came out a little flat, and he almost apologized for it. But she made a sound that was unmistakably a real laugh. Short, surprised, quickly controlled, but real. And he decided not to apologize. "No," she said. "You're really not." They finished dinner. She helped clear, and he got the fire built up high for the night, and the wind outside had settled into a steady groan that was better than the howling of the previous days. He sat in his chair, and she sat in hers, and they were quiet for a while. But it was a different silence than the one she'd brought off the stagecoach. This one had room in it. She spoke first. "My grandfather called that land the best 30 acres in the county. He said the soil was so deep you could put your arm in it up to the elbow and still not hit rock." She was looking at the fire. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before, but not pain, something under pain, something older. "He left it to my mother. She left it to me. Before I married Martin, it was in my name. That was unusual. He said so himself, said most men would have wanted it transferred before the wedding." She paused. "He said it like it was a compliment, like he was being gracious about it." Thorne said nothing. "I think about my grandfather sometimes," she said. "I think about whether he would have recognized what I married into, or whether Martin was good enough at presentation that even my grandfather would have missed it. I've never settled on an answer." "Probably he would have missed it," Thorne said. "Those men are good at presentation. That's most of what they are." She nodded slowly. "After I got out, after Martin died and I understood what Silas was planning, the thing that kept me moving was the thought of that land sitting there with someone else's name on it. My grandfather's 30 acres with a forged signature on the paperwork." Her jaw tightened for just a second. "That's not going to stand." "No," Thorne agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. "I'm going to fight this. In court if it comes to that. I have everything I need to fight it." "I know," he said. "I'll be there." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to make promises like that." "I'm not promising. I'm stating a fact." He looked at the fire. "You fight this? I'll be standing next to you when you do. That's just how it is." She opened her mouth and closed it. He didn't look at her because he sensed she needed a minute with something, and being watched wasn't going to help. When she spoke again, her voice was a half note different than usual, tighter. "Why?" "Because it's right," he said, "and because you've spent enough time fighting things alone." The fire crackled. Wind moved over the roof in a long, low note. She didn't say anything for a long time, and he let the silence run. And somewhere in the middle of it, she reached over and picked up the mending she'd been ignoring for 2 days and started working on it. And he picked up the piece of harness leather he'd been meaning to condition. And they sat like that until the fire burned low and it was time to sleep. He banked the fire and said goodnight, and she said goodnight back and went to the back room, and he heard the door close, and he stood still for a moment in the quiet cabin. The bolt didn't slide. He heard it, or rather, he heard its absence. The small mechanical sound that had closed every night since she'd arrived was not there. He wasn't sure she'd meant it as a signal. He wasn't sure she'd even noticed. But he noticed, and he stood there for a few seconds with the weight of it, and then he went to his bed and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind work over the ridge. He thought about 30 acres of deep soil and a forged signature and a man named Silas, who was patient in the way that only men who have never been held accountable are patient, who have never had to be in a hurry because the world has always bent toward them eventually. He thought, not this time. He thought, not on this mountain. And somewhere between that thought and sleep, he made a decision that wasn't dramatic and didn't require announcing. The kind of decision that just settles into you like a foundation settling into ground, slow and solid, and meant to hold weight. Whatever was coming down out of the east, it was going to meet something it hadn't planned on. Two people instead of one. The storm broke on the fifth day. Not all at once. It eased off grudgingly, the way bad things often do, still spitting snow on the morning of the fifth day, even as the sky began breaking up in places, showing blue underneath. By afternoon, the wind had dropped to something manageable and the temperature had come up 4 degrees, which out here in December felt almost generous. Elena went out to the stable first before he did. He watched her from the window. She'd found the heavier coat on the peg, the one he'd left out 2 weeks ago, and she had it buttoned up and her hair tucked under a wool cap, and she moved through the knee-deep snow with the same deliberate efficiency she brought to everything, kicking a path to the stable door and getting it open and disappearing inside. He put his own coat on and went out after her. She had already done a full check on all 3 horses by the time he got in there. She had her hand on the neck of the bay, the difficult one who didn't like strangers, and he was standing quiet under her hand with his eyes half closed, which Thorne had never managed in 3 years of owning the animal. "He's stiff on the left foreleg," she said without turning around. "Not the hoof, higher. I think he pulled something when he was moving around in the stall during the storm. He needs liniment and a few days easy." Thorne looked at the horse. The bay flicked an ear at him. "He doesn't usually let people touch him." She stroked the horse's neck once more. "He was scared," she said. "He just needed someone to acknowledge it. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't think he needed to." They worked the stable together for the next hour, clearing the compacted straw, checking the water, getting the animals fed and settled. She worked alongside him without bumping into his decisions or duplicating his effort. She seemed to intuitively understand what he was going to do next and simply took the other thing, so that the work moved faster than it ever did when he was alone without either of them having to coordinate out loud. At one point, they reached for the same pitchfork handle at the same moment, and their hands landed in the same place at the same time. He felt her go still. That instant full-body stillness he knew by now was not anger and not discomfort, but the reflex of someone whose body had learned that unexpected contact meant something was about to go wrong. He took his hand off the handle. "Yours," he said, and went to get the other one from the corner. He heard her breathe again. He didn't look back at her. That moment sat with him through the rest of the afternoon. Not with sadness exactly, and not with frustration. With something more complicated. An understanding of how deep the damage went, how far down into the muscle and bone of a person a sustained fear can settle, how it doesn't leave just because the danger is gone. He had always known this in a general way, the way most people know things they haven't lived. But he was learning it now in a specific way, through specific moments, and specific knowledge is heavier than general knowledge. It has more corners. It takes up more room. He was not handling it perfectly. He knew that. There had been moments he'd moved too fast, said something before thinking about how it landed, asked a question and felt her close off in response. I was not a careful man by nature. The mountains had made him direct, and the solitude had made him unaccustomed to calibrating what he said before he said it. He was learning, the same way she was learning, just from the other side. After dinner that evening, she got the small notebook out again. But this time, she didn't close it when he came to the table. She set it open between them and turned it so he could see. He looked down at it. It was a list, dates, down the left side. Next to each date, in her clean, careful handwriting, a brief entry. A month and a year at the top of one entry. Another month, 6 weeks later, a winter, a spring. Document names, reference numbers, the doctor's name, a Dr. Harlan Voss of Hester County. And beside his name, the phrase signed testimony, copy retained. She let him look at it for a long time. "This is what I have," she said. "It's enough," he said. Not because he was telling her what she needed to hear, because he could see that it was. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands on the table. "I need you to know something," she said, "about why I'm showing you this." He waited. "I'm not showing you because I need you to fix it," she said. "I have been working on this for 2 years and I know what it is and what it does. I'm showing you because—" She paused, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen before, something that was almost uncertainty, real uncertainty, not the careful managed version she wore most of the time. "Because you said you'd be there. And if you're going to be there, you should know what you're standing next to." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know what I'm standing next to," he said. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the notebook. Her hands had gone very still again. But it wasn't the stillness of someone holding herself together this time. It was something else. Something that didn't have as much fear in it. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were moving east off the ridge, and the sky above Granite Ridge was clearing for the first time in 5 days, going dark and wide and full of stars in the way mountain skies do when they're finally done with something and ready to be just sky again. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and the lamp held its oil, and 2 people sat at a worn table with a notebook between them, and neither of them was exactly sure what this was becoming, but both of them understood that it was real, and it was earned, and it had weight to it, the good kind of weight, the kind that doesn't crush you but keeps you from blowing away. And somewhere east of the mountain, a patient man was looking at a map. His name was Silas Whitlock, and his patience, after 2 years of it, was finally running out. The stars that had come out after the storm were gone by morning, covered over by a flat gray sky that promised nothing good. Thorne read it when he stepped outside at first light. The particular quality of that gray, the way the air sat heavy and still without any of the clean bite that usually followed a clearing. And he knew another system was building. Not today probably, maybe not tomorrow. But within the week, the mountain was going to get hit again, and this time it had the feel of something that meant to stay. He didn't say anything to Elena about it over breakfast. She'd read the sky herself before he had, most likely. She read everything before he had. What he did say, because it had been sitting in him since the night before, was this. I want to ride down to Caldwell's before the next system comes in. We need lamp oil, and I want to send a letter. She looked up from her coffee. To who? A man named Garrett. He's a land attorney in Mill Haven. I've known him 8 years. He's straight, which is rarer than it should be. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. I want to know what the territorial law says about fraudulent property transfers, specifically what it takes to challenge a filing that was made with false witness signatures. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through something. You don't need to do that, she said. I know I don't need to, he said. I want to. It could take weeks to hear back. Then I'll send the letter today. Another pause. She was looking at the table, not at him. He waited. He'd learned to wait. Ask him so, she said finally, about the process for registering a prior deed in a new territory when the original filing was made in a different county under a different jurisdiction. He looked at her. You've already thought through the legal angle. I've thought through every angle, she said. I just didn't know if I had someone to help me execute them. You do now, he said. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window and didn't say anything else, but the set of her shoulders had changed in a way he'd gotten good at reading, less braced against the next thing, more like someone who had just set down something they'd been carrying for a long distance and were taking a moment to feel the absence of the weight. He rode down the mountain that afternoon while the weather held, got the lamp oil, sent the letter to Garrett with a careful description of the situation, enough to give the man what he needed. Not enough detail to put anything in writing that could be used against Elena if the letter went wrong somewhere. He knew how to be careful. The mountains had taught him that too. On the way back up, he stopped at the Ridge Outlook, a place he sometimes stopped because it was one of the few spots on the mountain where you could see a long way east, all the way to where the foothills started to flatten out toward the lower country. He sat on his horse for a few minutes and looked out at it. Somewhere out there, past the foothills and the river crossings and the long, flat miles of road, was a man named Silas Whitlock. Thorne didn't know what Silas looked like. He'd formed a picture from the things Elena hadn't said as much as the things she had. The way she went slightly more still when she said the name. The way she'd described him as more patient than Martin, more careful about how he showed what he was. A man who wore his danger quietly. Those were often the harder ones to deal with because they didn't give you the warning that loud men gave you. They moved in the register of paperwork and social pressure and the quiet word in the right ear, and by the time you understood what was happening, the damage was already arranged. He turned his horse around and headed up the mountain. Christmas came and went without either of them making much of it. She made a better dinner than usual. She'd been rationing the dried apples, and she used some of them in a dish with the salt pork that was genuinely good, better than anything he'd made in years of eating alone. And he'd gone out 2 days before and brought back a small pine bough and set it on the mantel because it seemed like the right gesture, and he wasn't sure how to make the right gesture with anything more than that. She'd looked at it for a moment and then gone, and found a piece of red ribbon in the bottom of her carpet bag and tied it around the middle of the bough without saying anything, and that had been Christmas. It was enough. More than enough. January arrived and nailed itself to the mountain with a kind of permanence that made November look tentative. The cold was the kind that found every gap in your reasoning. You'd think you'd accounted for it, and then you'd find another place it had gotten in. The horses needed extra checking. The water barrel inside had to be kept closer to the fire. The stable roof started showing a slow leak over the east corner that required Thorn to go up twice in 1 week and pack it with a moss and pitch mixture that only half worked and would need a real fix in the spring. Elena, somewhere in the second week of January, started teaching him her weather system. He hadn't asked. She just started explaining it one morning when they were both watching the sky from the doorway, going through the specific indicators she used. Not just cloud formations, which he knew, but the way the wind moved through the pines at different altitudes, the sound the ridge made at night when certain systems were building, the behavior of the animals in the 2 or 3 days before a major storm. She'd developed it over years of watching, she said. She'd needed to know what was coming because knowing in advance was the difference between being caught out and being prepared. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked questions when she finished, good questions, specific ones, and she answered them in the direct way she had, and then he asked a few more, and after a while they were standing in the doorway in the cold having a real conversation, the kind where both people are interested in what the other is saying and not managing anything, just talking. It was the first time they'd had a conversation like that. He noticed it and was careful not to point at it, the way you don't point at a deer. She noticed it too. He could tell by the way she was slightly more careful after that, as if she'd let herself be unguarded for a few minutes and was now recalibrating. But the recalibration didn't go as far back as it used to. She didn't retreat all the way. She recalibrated to somewhere closer than where she'd been before, and then she stayed there. That was how it went, over and over, forward by degrees, back by slightly smaller degrees. He kept his patience with it because he could see what it was. Not resistance to him specifically, but the careful re-education of a nervous system that had spent years learning a specific lesson, and unlearning it took longer than learning it had. The letter from Garrett came back faster than he expected. 18 days, which meant the man had answered the same week it arrived. He read it at Caldwell's before he rode up, because he was in the habit of reading things before he brought them home, so he could think about how to present what they said. Garrett wrote in the precise language of a man who'd been practicing law for 20 years and knew that clarity was its own protection. He confirmed that fraudulent property transfers made through false witness signatures were challengeable under territorial law, and in some circumstances prosecutable. He said that a prior deed showing clear chain of ownership predating the contested transfer, combined with documented evidence of the forgery itself, would constitute a strong case. He said the testimony of a credentialed medical professional documenting patterns of injury consistent with abuse could also be relevant to establishing the broader context of coercion under which any marital property arrangements had been made. He said one more thing that Thorne read twice. He said that if the individual who had originally made the fraudulent filing, or their representative, were to come to the territory and attempt to pressure the current holder of the prior deed into surrendering it or signing any new documents, that itself could constitute criminal intimidation under territorial statute, provided it could be properly witnessed and documented. Thorne folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and rode up the mountain with it. He gave it to Elena when he got home. She read it at the table while he took care of the horse. When he came in, she was still holding it, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was looking at a spot on the table about a foot in front of the paper. "Garrett's good," Thorne said, pulling off his coat. "He's better than good," she said. "He just told me that if Silas comes here and tries what I know he's going to try, and we have a witness present, Silas commits a crime on top of everything else." That's what he said. She set the letter down carefully, like it was something that could break. "He's going to come. I need you to understand that I'm certain of it. He's not the kind of man who writes things off." "I understand." "When he does—" She stopped, started again. "I don't want you to be the one who speaks for me." He looked at her. "I mean," she seemed to be working around something. "I know you want to help. I know you'd step in front of it if I let you. But this is mine. The land is mine and the case is mine, and I need to be the one who faces him." She wasn't looking at him with apology in her eyes. She was looking at him with something that was close to need, which he understood was harder for her to show than anything else. I need to stand there myself, do you understand? Yes, he said. You can be in the room. All right. But I need to be the one who… Elena. He said her name quiet and level. I understand. You'll do the talking. I'll be there. She held his gaze for a moment, checking it, making sure he meant it, and not just a version of it. Then she nodded. Once. Okay? He nodded back. They ate dinner and talked about the roof repair and the horses and the supplies. And somewhere in the middle of it she mentioned, in a voice that was as close to casual as she got, that she thought by spring she'd want to go into Millhaven and visit a territorial land office. To register the deed, he said. In my name, under this jurisdiction. She moved something on her plate. I want it on record here. Not just in Hester County where everything is complicated. Here, where it's simple. I'll take you, he said. I know you can, he said. I'd like to. She looked at him for a second and then looked at her plate and said, all right. February brought the hardest stretch of the winter. 3 weeks of temperatures that made December look like a warm memory, and the wind came down off the peak with a consistency that was almost personal. Thorne lost 2 of the fence posts he'd been meaning to reinforce in the fall and spent a brutal afternoon in the worst of the cold, hammering them back, while Elena held the wire and neither of them could feel their hands by the time they got back inside. She'd gone out to help without being asked. He hadn't told her not to. They'd worked side by side in the kind of cold that simplified everything down to the next thing that needed doing. And when it was done, they'd come inside and stood by the fire and gotten the feeling back in their fingers. And she'd said, you should have done those in November. And he'd said, I know. And she'd made a sound that was the closest thing she had to a laugh when something wasn't actually funny. And that was the closest thing they had to a moment of levity in the whole ugly month. It was somewhere in the middle of February that Thorne started to understand something about himself that he hadn't fully faced before. He'd built this life on the mountain because he'd needed something that stayed, something that didn't change its mind or leave before the story was finished. The mountains had given him that. But what he'd built inside those mountains had been a life with everything load-bearing and nothing decorative, a life that worked, that held against the cold, that kept him alive and functional, but that had no warmth in it that he hadn't made himself. For himself, by himself. She had changed that, not by doing anything grand, by fixing fence posts and reading the sky, and closing notebooks when he came in the room, and teaching him about weather, and putting plates on the table in the evening, and locking her door less. By being in the space beside him and making that space different just by being in it. I wasn't sure what to call what it was becoming. He wasn't going to call it anything for a while yet because he was a careful man and she was a careful woman, and whatever this was, it deserved to be built right, not fast. But he knew what it wasn't anymore. It wasn't just a practical arrangement. It hadn't been that for a while. The letter from Silas Whitlock arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of February. It didn't come to Thorne. It came to Elena, forwarded through the agency that had arranged the marriage, which meant Silas had done his research and found the trail, which meant he'd been looking for a while. Caldwell had held it for her at the store when Thorne came down for supplies, handing it over with the careful neutrality of a man who minded his own business as a matter of professional survival. Thorne brought it up the mountain without opening it, which cost him something, and handed it to her without explanation. She looked at the handwriting on the outside for a long moment. From him, she said. Not a question. Looks that way. She opened it. He watched her face while she read it, which told him more than the letter would have. She didn't go pale. She didn't react in any of the ways fear usually showed itself. Her jaw tightened, once, at something near the middle of the page. Her eyes moved steady and even all the way to the end. Then she set it on the table and looked at it without touching it, the way you look at something you don't want your fingerprints on. He's coming, she said. When? He doesn't say exactly. He says he expects to be in the territory before the spring thaw. She paused. He calls it a family matter. He says there are legal questions that need to be resolved in person. She said these things in a voice of complete flatness. He says he hopes we can settle it quietly, and that Elena… She picked the letter back up and read the exact words. That Elena will be sensible about the situation given that prolonged legal disputation serves no one's interests. The word sensible landed in the room with the full weight Silas had put into it. Thorne looked at the fire. He means frightened, Elena said. He means he hopes I'll still be frightened enough to give him what he wants. Is he going to find that? She set the letter down again. No. He nodded. I want to write back, she said. All right. I want to write back and tell him that I received his letter and that he is welcome to come. She looked up at Thorn. I want him to come here, to this table, with whatever he's prepared to say, and I want to be ready for him. Then let's make sure you are, Thorn said. They spent the next 3 evenings going through everything she had. She retrieved the documents from where they were kept. She told him where at last, not because she'd been forced to, but because she'd decided to, and he understood the difference. A sealed oilskin packet tucked into the hollow of the wall behind the loose stone in the back room, the kind of hiding place that required knowing exactly where to look. She spread everything on the table. The original deed, the letters from her grandfather, the copies of the doctor's documentation, Dr. Harlan Voss's careful clinical language that made brutal things sound like ledger entries, which was perhaps what made them more devastating than dramatic language would have been. The copies of the fraudulent transfer filing with the witness signatures, and then beside them the letter from those same witnesses, which she'd somehow managed to obtain, in which they'd referred obliquely to having signed things they hadn't examined carefully because Martin Whitlock had assured them it was a formality. That one surprised him. How did you get this? One of them had a conscience, she said. After Martin died, he came to me. He was afraid. He didn't want to put anything in writing at first. I was very patient with him. She looked at the letter. Eventually, he wrote it. Thorn looked at the stack of documents on his kitchen table and thought about the 2 years she'd spent building this while she was also surviving, while she was also planning her escape, while she was also doing everything a woman was expected to do in a community that had decided not to see her. He didn't say what he was thinking because what he was thinking was too large to say. He just picked up the letter from the witness and read it through and set it back down. This is a strong case, he said. I know it is. Silas knows enough to know it's a strong case. She looked at him. Which means he's not coming here to fight it legally. He's coming here because he thinks he can still scare me into not using it. Then he's in for a lesson, Thorn said. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. She didn't do those easily, and he wasn't sure he'd want her to change that. It was something more interior than a smile. A settling. Like a wall that had been built for defense, discovering it could also be a foundation. She organized the documents back into their order and put them into the oilskin packet and sealed it. Then she held it in her hands for a moment. When I first found the original deed, she said, I kept it in my shoe for 3 weeks. I didn't know where else to put it that Martin wouldn't find it. I walked around on my grandfather's farmland deed for 3 weeks. She looked at the packet. I'd take it out at night to make sure the sweat hadn't smeared the ink. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the ink held? The ink held. She set the packet on the table. It held through everything. He reached over and put the packet in the center of the table between them, not claimed by either side. We'll be ready, he said. She looked at the packet and then at him. He's going to try to use the fact that I married you, she said. He'll try to argue that property matters are now your domain, that I can't act independently on land claims made before the marriage, that you need to be the one to sign anything or contest anything. He can try that, Thorn said. What will you say? I'll say she handles her own affairs, and the land is hers and always was, and if he wants to argue about what my wife can do, he can explain that position to Garrett in Mill Haven. He paused. And then I'll step back and let you finish him. She pressed her lips together. Her hands were on the table, flat and still, but not in the way they went still when she was holding herself together. This was different. This was just stillness. You keep doing that, she said. What? Saying things that I've never heard a man say before. She wasn't looking at him with anything soft. She was looking at him with the direct, measuring look she used when she was trying to determine if something was real. And then acting like they're ordinary. They are ordinary, he said. They should be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, out at the window where the February dark had settled in over the mountain, and she was quiet for a while. And when she spoke again, her voice had that half-note quality he'd heard a handful of times, the quality of someone saying something they haven't said before and aren't sure yet what it cost them. I think I'm going to be all right, she said. I think, For the first time in a very long time, I actually think that. He looked at the fire. You were going to be all right regardless, he said. I just want to be around to see it. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. She picked up the oilskin packet and went to put it back in its place behind the stone, and he heard the stone settle back into the wall, and then she came out and said she was going to sleep, and he said good night, and she went to the back room. The bolt didn't slide. It hadn't slid in 11 days. He'd counted, not because he was keeping score of anything, but because he was the kind of man who noticed things and couldn't stop. And what the count meant was something he didn't put into words because words had a way of making fragile things. Fragile. He sat by the and thought about Silas Whitlock making his way west through the tail end of winter with a plan that had made sense when he'd built it. A frightened widow, alone and isolated, easy to pressure, and would find something entirely different when he arrived. He thought, come on then, and stoked the fire and went to sleep and dreamed of nothing in particular, which was the best kind of dreaming. March came in the way it always did on Granite Ridge, not as a relief from winter but as a negotiation with it. The snow didn't leave, it just shifted its weight, settled differently. Let the sun touch it for a few hours in the afternoon before the temperature dropped again at night and refroze everything that had dared to soften. The days got longer by minutes, which felt like nothing until you noticed it was dark at 6 instead of 4:30, and then it felt like something after all. Thorne had been watching the lower trail. He didn't mention it to Elena. She knew he was watching it. She watched it herself. He'd seen her, standing at the window in the early mornings with her coffee held in both hands, and her eyes on the place where the trail came out of the tree line. Neither of them talked about it. It would have been like talking about the weather when the weather was already in the room. He'd sent a second letter to Garrett in Millhaven, this one more specific. He'd described Silas Whitlock by name, described the letter they'd received, and asked Garrett to confirm in writing that any attempt to coerce Elena into signing documents or surrendering property through intimidation or misrepresentation of her legal rights would be actionable under territorial statute. Garrett had written back in a week, and the letter was now in the oilskin packet behind the stone in the back room with everything else. They were ready. He kept telling himself that. Elena had gone quieter in the weeks since Silas's letter arrived, but it wasn't the old quiet, not the managed, defended silence of the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach in the fall. This was the quiet of someone who had made their decision and was living inside it, not second-guessing, just waiting for the moment when the decision would be tested. He recognized it because it was the same way he went quiet before a hard hunt in bad weather. You did your preparation, and then you got still, not from fear, but from a particular kind of focus that fear couldn't afford. She'd said something in the stable one afternoon that stayed with him. They'd been checking the bay. His leg had fully healed, and she'd been the one to declare it, running her hand carefully down to the hoof and back up, saying he's right with the confidence of someone who'd been paying close attention. And she'd said, without looking up, I used to practice what I'd say to Silas. I'd go over it in my head at night for months. What did you come up with? Thorne had asked. Nothing that worked, she'd said. Everything I thought of felt like I was still asking his permission to exist. She'd moved to the next horse. I stopped practicing after a while. I decided I'd just say what was true when the time came. He'd thought about that for days. There was something in it that was more than strategy. It was a philosophy, a way of understanding what real strength looked like versus the performance of it. Practiced arguments were just another form of armor, and she'd spent too many years behind armor to want any more of it now. Silas Whitlock rode up the mountain on the second Thursday of March. Thorne saw him first. I was splitting wood in the yard when the sound of a single horse on the lower trail reached him, and there was something in the pace of it, deliberate, unhurried, the pace of a man who believed arrival was inevitable and therefore saw no point in rushing, that told him before he saw anything that this wasn't Caldwell's delivery boy or a lost traveler. He set the axe down carefully against the splitting stump and didn't pick it back up. Elena appeared in the cabin doorway. She'd heard it too. They looked at each other across the yard, maybe 30 feet of cold March air between them. Her face was composed. Not blank. He knew her well enough now to read the difference. Composed meant she was in it, fully, already past whatever fear might have been there, and on the other side of it, where the work was. Inside, she said. He went in and she followed, and they stood in the main room and listened to the horse come up the last stretch of trail and stop outside. Boots hit the frozen ground. A pause. The man was looking at the homestead, taking stock, reading what he could from the outside of the place before he knocked. Thorne had done the same thing 100 times, approaching a camp or a cabin in the wilderness. It was what careful people did. 3 knocks, measured, confident. Elena walked to the door and opened it. Silas Whitlock was perhaps 60, maybe a year or two under. He was tall and lean in the way of a man who had always been deliberate about his presentation. A coat that was good quality, well-maintained, boots that had been cleaned recently despite the trail mud. His face was narrow and composed, with the particular blankness of a man who had spent decades making sure his expressions told people exactly what he wanted them to see and nothing else. His eyes moved fast when the door opened, over Elena, to Thorne standing back near the far wall, around the visible interior of the room, and then returned to Elena with the practiced neutrality of someone performing reasonableness. "Elena," he said, almost warm. "Mr. Whitlock," she said. Not cold, not warm, just accurate. He looked past her at Thorne. "You'd be the husband." "Thorne Mercer," Thorne said. Silas nodded with the air of a man confirming something he'd already researched. "I appreciate you both receiving me. The ride-up is some ask this time of year." He said it pleasantly, like a man who'd dropped by for coffee. Elena stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in and stood for a moment, taking in the room without appearing to take it in. The fireplace, the table, the shelves, the 2 chairs by the fire. Thorne stayed where he was near the far wall, close enough to be present, far enough to make clear the conversation wasn't his to lead. "Sit," Elena said, and gestured to the chair on the far side of the table. She sat on her side. Silas sat on his, setting his hat on the table beside him with the ease of a man settling in for a business meeting he expected to control. He folded his hands and looked at Elena with an expression of measured concern, the kind that looked like empathy from a distance but had nothing warm at the center of it. "You're looking well," he said. "The mountain seems to agree with you." "It does," she said. "I'm glad to hear it." A pause. A breath. The performance of reluctance before the subject. "I want you to know I come here without hostility. Whatever difficulties existed in the past, and I acknowledge there were difficulties, I'd like to set them aside and talk practically. There are legal matters that have been left unresolved, and I think it serves everyone to resolve them simply." "What matters specifically?" Elena said. That fractional adjustment in his face again. He'd expected her to wait for him to lay it out, to let him frame the conversation, to position her as the recipient of his explanation rather than someone conducting her own inquiry. He recalibrated smoothly. He was good at that, but not before Thorne caught it. "The Alderman parcel," Silas said. "Your grandfather's farmland in Hester County." "My land," Elena said. "That's what we need to discuss." He spread his hands. Open, reasonable. "There was a filing made during your marriage that transferred the parcel into the marital estate, under Martin's administration. That filing was made in good faith, with proper witnesses. The filing was fraudulent," she said. "The witnesses' signatures were obtained under false representation. I have a written statement from one of those witnesses acknowledging that he signed without understanding what he was signing because Martin told him it was a routine marital formality." She said this without raising her voice, without any of the heat that would have given him something to manage. "I also have the original deed in my name. It predates my marriage by 11 years. It shows a clear chain of ownership from my grandfather through my mother to me, unbroken." Silas was quiet for a moment. His hands, still folded on the table, didn't move. "There are competing interpretations of— I also have correspondence," she continued, showing that Martin had been planning the transfer filing for at least 2 years before he executed it. He chose those specific witnesses because they owed him. That's not a competing interpretation. That's a record. The room held its quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the upper pines with the particular sound it made on clear March days, low and continuous, like something breathing. Silas looked at her for a moment, and then shifted his approach the way a river shifts around a rock, looking for the lower path. "Elena." His voice dropped into something more personal, almost gentle. "I want to be honest with you. I know that your marriage to my brother was not— I know it was not what it should have been. And I want you to know that I am genuinely sorry for any suffering that resulted from that." He paused. "But that is a separate matter from the property question. What I'm asking is that we resolve the legal situation between us quietly without the expense and exposure of a territorial court proceeding that I don't think serves either of us." She looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was level and unhurried and absolutely clear. "When your brother was alive," she said, "and what he was doing was visible to anyone who chose to look, you chose not to look, not to speak, not to the elders of the congregation, not to the county officials, not to him directly in any way that would have changed anything." She watched him. "I saw you on a Sunday morning in April, the spring I'd fallen on the stair. I know you saw me. I know what I looked like. You shook my husband's hand and asked after his harvest plans." She paused. "I'm not telling you this for your benefit. I'm telling you so that we are both working from an accurate record of what happened before we discuss anything else." Something moved in Silas Whitlock's face. Not remorse. Thorne didn't think it was that. But something close to the physical experience of hearing your own history said out loud by someone who had been inside it. Something that could not be managed away because it was too specific and too true. He picked up his hat and set it back down. Elena reached into her coat and set the oilskin packet on the table between them. She didn't open it. She placed one hand flat on top of it and kept her eyes on Silas. "Dr. Harlan Voss," she said, "Hester County. He examined me on 2 separate occasions and documented his findings in writing. He indicated to me at the time that he would testify to those findings if I ever required it." She pressed her fingers slightly against the packet. "His documentation uses the specific language that the injuries he observed were, quote, inconsistent with accidental causes, and that the pattern and distribution of same suggested a sustained history of inflicted trauma." She said the clinical words in the same voice she'd used to read a supply list. "I have copies of both examinations." Silas said nothing. "I also have a letter from an attorney in Mill Haven," she said, "informing me that any attempt to pressure me into signing documents, surrendering property, or otherwise acting against my legal interests through intimidation constitutes criminal conduct under territorial statute." She looked at him without blinking. "Mr. Mercer has been present for this entire conversation and is a witness to what has been said." The quiet in the room had a texture to it now. Not tense, past tense. More like the quiet after a thing has been decided and everyone in the room knows it, but no one has said so yet. Silas looked at the packet, then at Elena, then, briefly, at Thorne. Not for help, not looking for an ally, just the look of a man checking whether there was any variable he'd missed. Thorne looked back with nothing in his face worth reading. "You've been thorough," Silas said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, working through it. Thorne could see the calculation, what he'd arrived with versus what was sitting across the table from him, and the mathematics of that gap. Patient men were pragmatic. They didn't spend resources on lost positions. The question was whether he'd accept the loss cleanly or whether he'd try one more angle. He tried one more angle. "Even if the filing were successfully challenged," he said carefully, "there is the question of any improvements or administration of the parcel during the intervening years. There are arguments to be made about the estate's investment in the property during—" "There were no improvements," Elena said. "The parcel has been sitting idle since Martin's death. I verified this through a land agent in Hester County before I left. The property is in the same condition it was when the fraudulent filing was made." She didn't give him a breath between his statement and hers. "And even if there had been improvements, they would not constitute grounds for a property claim that began in fraud." He stopped. She let the silence sit there. "If you pursue this claim in a territorial court," she said, "I will present the deed, the witness recantation, Dr. Voss's documentation, the correspondence showing premeditation, and an attorney who has reviewed the full case and believes it is clear-cut. That proceeding will be public record." She paused. "Everything in this packet will be public record." Silas looked at the packet one more time. Whatever he was calculating, he finished calculating it. "If I were to walk away from the filing," he said. His voice had changed, quieter. The performance of reasonableness had gone out of it, and what was left was just a tired man who had traveled a long way for a conversation that had not gone the way he'd planned. "Formally abandon the claim. Then I register the original deed in this territory under my name, which I'm doing regardless," Elena said. "And I have no reason to bring anything else into a courtroom. The other matters. Stay in this room." She looked at him steadily. "And you don't come back." He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his hat and stood. He was still composed. The composure of a man who has absorbed a defeat and is deciding how to carry it out of the room with the least visible damage. He put on his hat and buttoned his coat, and he walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. Thorne watched him carefully. This was the moment that could go either way. The parting shot, the last attempt to leave some mark on the encounter, or the thing a person said when the performance finally fell away because there was no point in maintaining it. "You were never what Martin said you were," Silas said. He looked at Elena directly, the first time he'd looked at her without something calculated behind it. "I want you to know I understood that, even at the time." Elena held his gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet it was almost nothing, but it carried. "I know you knew," she said. "That's why I'm telling you to leave." He left. They heard his boots on the frozen ground, the creak of the saddle, the horse moving out of the yard and finding the trail. The sound of it faded into the pines, and then there was nothing but the ordinary sounds of the mountain, wind, fire, the distant complaint of one of the horses in the stable. Elena did not move for a long moment. Then she took her hand off the oilskin packet and set both hands in her lap and looked at the table and breathed. 3 slow breaths. Thorne watched her and said nothing because nothing was what was needed right now. She was coming back from somewhere, from the place a person goes when they've been holding everything together under pressure, and the pressure has released, and the body has to figure out what to do with the energy it had prepared for a fight that ended before it ran out. Her hands, when he finally saw them clearly, were not entirely steady, just slightly. A small tremor in the fingers that she wasn't trying to hide, which told him more than the steadiness throughout the confrontation had. She'd been scared. Of course she had. She'd been terrified, probably, in the way that people who've survived real danger are terrified. Not visibly, not disablingly, but deeply, in the muscles and the blood, even while the mind stays clear and the voice stays level. That steadiness hadn't been the absence of fear. It had been what she'd built on top of it. "You all right?" he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dry. "Yes." She checked it internally, the way she always checked things. "Yes, I actually am." He came to the table and sat down across from her. "He wasn't what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "More of Martin," she said. "Martin was loud about it. When he couldn't get what he wanted, he got louder. Silas just goes quieter and looks for another door." She looked at her hands, noticed the tremor, and pressed them flat on the table deliberately. "He almost found one. The improvements argument. I thought about it, but not as much as I should have." "It didn't land," Thorne said. "Because I was ready enough," she said. "But it was close." She didn't say it with false modesty. She said it like someone filing an accurate report. "I need to mention it to Garrett when I write to him, so it's closed off in the registration paperwork." He looked at her. She just walked out of the most significant confrontation of her adult life and was already identifying the things she needed to do better. He didn't know whether to be impressed or slightly worried about her, and settled on both. "Can you stop working for 5 minutes?" he said. She looked at him with the expression that was almost amusement, but not quite. "Can you?" He considered. "No," he admitted. "Then we understand each other," she said, and something in her face softened by a fraction. Not much. Just enough to let the light through. They sat for a while at the table with the oilskin packet between them and the fire doing its job and the afternoon moving slowly toward evening, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space with words. There had been enough words today. Some kinds of quiet were earned. Later, when the fire needed building up and dinner needed starting, they moved around the cabin the way they'd learned to move around each other. Without collision, without announcement, occupying the same space with the efficiency of 2 people who had figured out each other's rhythms over a long winter of close quarters. She got the water on. He brought in more wood. She found what was in the stores to work with. He set the table. None of it was graceful, exactly. He bumped his shoulder on the shelf edge. She burned her wrist slightly on the pot and said something under her breath that wasn't polite. But it was real, and it worked, and it was theirs. Over dinner, she said, "I want to go to Millhaven, the land office." "Next week," he said. "Trail should be passable by Wednesday if this weather holds. I want to register the deed in my name under this jurisdiction before the month is out." She moved food around her plate with the distracted focus of someone whose mind was slightly ahead of their body. I want it on record here, not just in Hester County, where everything is tangled up in Martin's estate and the congregation's version of events. Here, it's clean. I'll take you, he said. She started to say she could manage alone and then stopped, and he waited, and she said, "All right, thank you." He nodded, and they kept eating. It was one of the small moments that didn't look like anything from the outside. She'd started to refuse help, caught herself, and accepted it. For most people, that would be nothing. For her, he understood, it was a thing that had required practice. The decision to let someone be beside you without it costing you something, that was learned, and the learning was slow, and he'd watched her doing it all winter without ever pointing at it. That night, after dinner, she got out the small personal notebook. Not the supply ledger, the other one, the one she'd been writing in since before he understood what it was for. She sat by the fire and wrote in it for a long time, longer than usual. He read across from her and let her be in it. When she finally closed it, she held it in her lap and looked at the fire for a while. "What do you write in it?" he asked. He'd asked once before, months ago. She'd said things I'm noticing. He was curious whether the answer had changed. She looked down at the cover. "Tonight I wrote down everything he said," she said. "Every argument he tried, in case I need to remember exactly what was said and in what order." She paused. "And then I wrote something else." He waited. "I wrote that I wasn't afraid while it was happening," she said. "I mean, I was, but not in the way I used to be afraid. Before, being afraid of Silas meant being afraid of what he could do to me, what he could take, how much smaller he could make everything." She turned the notebook over in her hands. "Today I was afraid of making a mistake, of missing something, but I wasn't afraid of him." She looked up. "That's different. That's a different kind of fear entirely, and I wanted to write it down before I forgot what it felt like." He looked at her. "It felt like being a person," she said. "Just a regular person who was nervous about something important, not someone trying to survive." He thought about what to say and decided on honesty. "You've been a regular person for a while," he said. "You were just the last one to know it." She looked at him with the direct, measuring look. Then she looked back at the fire. "Maybe," she said. The trip to Millhaven on Wednesday was cold but clear, the kind of March day where the sun was genuinely present, even if the warmth was still theoretical. They rode down together, and Thorne waited with the horses outside the territorial land office, while Elena went in with the oilskin packet under her arm and her chin at the level she carried it when she'd decided something was going to happen a certain way. She was in there for nearly an hour. He waited without impatience. He'd spent enough years waiting out weather and animals and slow seasons to have a decent relationship with waiting. He walked the horses a little to keep them from stiffening in the cold, and he watched the street traffic of a small territorial town going about its business. A supply wagon navigating the ruts, two women talking outside the dry goods store, a boy running some errand at speed, and he thought about Elena inside the land office, setting her grandfather's deed on a registrar's desk and watching it become a matter of official territorial record. He thought about that deed, worn at the folds from years of being unfolded and refolded and hidden and moved and kept safe through everything. He thought about her carrying it in her shoe for 3 weeks. He thought about the ink that it held. When she came out, she stood on the step for a moment before she saw him. She was holding the oilskin packet, but it was lighter, one document fewer. She'd left the deed with the registrar to be copied and recorded. Her face was not triumphant, not the way a person looks when they've won something. She looked like someone who'd set down a weight they'd been carrying for so long they'd stopped noticing the carrying and was now standing straight for the first time in years and figuring out what that felt like in the body. He brought her horse over. She mounted and they turned up the mountain road and rode for a while without talking, the horses picking their way up the trail with the careful patience of animals who'd made this trip enough times to have opinions about it. "It's done?" he said, when the town had disappeared behind the first ridge. "It's on record," she said. Garrett was right. The prior deed supersedes the fraudulent filing completely. The registrar said there's no legal mechanism by which Silas could challenge a properly recorded prior deed without demonstrating the original was invalid, which he cannot do. She said this in the organized way she recounted legal information, precise and sequential. Then she stopped and was quiet for a moment. He also said, the registrar, he said it was a clean title. That was the phrase he used. He said it was one of the cleaner titles he'd processed. She paused. I don't think he meant anything by it. I think it was just a professional observation, but I kept thinking about that word, clean. It is clean, Thorne said. My grandfather would have said the same thing, she said. He always said good land was honest. They rode on. The mountain was doing what mountains do in early March, conceding small amounts of ground to the season, a patch of bare dirt here, a thinning of snow there, while making clear that winter was not fully finished and would not be hurried. There were weeks yet. But the light was different now. Even the cold was different, less settled, less certain of itself. Halfway up, Elena said, I need to tell you something. He looked over at her. She was watching the trail ahead. When I came here, she said, I came because I needed distance and I needed a reason to be somewhere new that wouldn't look like running. The agency provided that. She kept her eyes on the trail. I want to tell you that plainly because I never did, and you deserve to know it from the beginning instead of having to figure it out yourself. I figured it out, he said. First week. She glanced at him. And? And I was here for reasons too, he said. I was a man who'd been talking to horses and expecting conversation back. I wasn't arriving with a lot of requirements about your motivations. She was quiet for a moment. That's very generous. It's just accurate, he said. She looked at the trail again. What I want to say, the thing I'm actually trying to say, is that it started practical, coming here, and it isn't that anymore. She said it the way she said things she'd decided to say, directly, without softening, without the careful strategic framing she used for most things. I'm not good at saying these things. I've spent a lot of years not saying things, so the habit is wrong for this kind of conversation, but I'm trying to say it plainly. He looked at her riding beside him, the coat that fit now, the way she held the reins. Not tight, not loose, with the same calibrated ease she'd developed for everything on the mountain. You don't have to be good at it, he said. Neither am I. Thorne. What? I'm trying to tell you that I care about you, she said. In whatever way I'm currently capable of caring about someone, which I'll admit is still being worked out. But that's what I'm trying to say. He kept his eyes on the trail for a moment, then, I know that. He made a sound. Not exasperation exactly. I'm saying it out loud. I know you are. He looked over at her. I'm glad you are. He let that sit for a second. I care about you too. In whatever way two people who arrived at each other for practical reasons and spent a winter figuring out what the other one was actually made of. That's what I mean when I say it. She looked at him for a long moment from horseback. That's a very long way of saying it. I'm a man of few words except when I'm nervous, he said. She made the short, surprised sound that was her version of a real laugh. It was still brief, still quickly contained, but he'd stopped expecting it to last longer. Its brevity was part of what made it worth hearing. They rode the rest of the way up in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The horses knew the trail. The mountain held them at its usual indifferent steadiness, and neither of them needed to fill the silence because the silence was full already. The cabin was cold when they got back, the fire having burned to low coals. Elena went in and rebuilt it while Thorne saw to the horses, and by the time he came inside the room was warming up, and she had water on and was looking at the supply shelf with the expression she wore when she was planning dinner and finding the supplies inadequate. We're low on everything, she said. I'll go down Thursday. Salt pork, oats, the good flour, she said, and lamp oil. We're on our last bottle. Caldwell might be out of the good flour, he said. Then he can order it, she said. I've been making do with the second grade for 4 months. I'm done making do. He hung his coat and turned away so she wouldn't see him smiling. All right, he said, the good flour. They made dinner with what was left in the stores, which turned out to be more manageable than Elena's inventory assessment had suggested. There was always more than the tally, because she kept precise counts, and precise counts always revealed more than vague impressions. They ate and talked about the stable roof, which needed proper repair come spring. About the south fence. About whether it was worth trying to add a second animal to the stable before next winter. Normal things. The accumulated ordinary business of a life that belonged to both of them now, not by declaration but by accumulation. Each shared morning and meal and work project and evening, by the fire adding itself to the total until the total was too big to be argued with. After dinner, she got out the small notebook again and wrote in it for a few minutes, and then she closed it and did something she hadn't done before. She pushed it across the table toward him. He looked at it, then at her. "The last page," she said. "Just that page." He opened it to the last page. Her handwriting, clean and careful as everything she did. He read it. It was a short entry, dated that day. It said, "The deed is registered. My name is on it. In this territory. In the official record. No one can take it." I rode home next to a man who waited for me outside the land office with the horses and didn't ask how it went until I was ready to say, "I think that might be what safety feels like. I'm going to keep checking to make sure." He read it twice. Then he closed the notebook and pushed it back. She was looking at the fire. "You can keep checking," he said. She picked up the notebook and held it. "I know," she said, and her voice was different from how it had been. Not the controlled, steady register she maintained for most things. Not the clinical precision she used for difficult subjects. Just her voice, unguarded, the way a voice sounds when the person behind it has stopped performing anything and is just present. He sat back in his chair and looked at the fire too, and they sat that way for a while. And eventually the fire needed banking and it was time to sleep, and she said good night and went to the back room and the door closed behind her. No bolt. He sat in the quiet for a few minutes after. He thought about the woman on the stagecoach, the carpet bag, the scanning eyes, the grip on the wagon seat when a branch cracked in the trees. He thought about the bolt sliding home every night like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that said, "I'm still afraid." He thought about the first night it hadn't slid and all the nights after. He thought about what she'd written. "I think that might be what safety feels like. I'm going to keep checking to make sure." He thought, "That's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. Not I'm healed, not I'm not afraid anymore. Not the clean narrative where a woman finds the right situation and all the damage resolves itself into wisdom and she emerges without marks." She wasn't without marks. She was going to be checking for a long time yet, probably. There would still be mornings where the weight of the past settled in before she was fully awake. There would still be moments when her body remembered things she'd rather it forgot. That was the truth of surviving something. It doesn't end, it just becomes something you carry differently. But she was checking. She was present and paying attention and writing it down, building a record of what safe felt like, so she'd be able to recognize it again, so it couldn't be taken from her the way other things had been taken. Quietly, gradually, while she was convinced she was imagining the loss. That was the bravest thing he knew of. Not the confrontation with Silas, not the 2 years of building a legal case while surviving a dangerous man, not even getting on a stagecoach to a mountain she'd never seen to marry a stranger. All of that was brave, but it was the kind of brave that circumstances demanded, the courage you find because the alternative is worse. The brave thing, the thing that cost more, that was a choice all the way down, was deciding, after everything, to let something be real, to sit across a table from a person and let them matter, to push a notebook across a table and let them read what you'd written, to go to sleep in the next room without the bolt. That was a decision made fresh every day, without the protection of necessity or urgency. Just the decision, repeated, to be present in something good. He thought about his own version of that decision. He'd been making it without naming it all winter. Each morning he'd chosen to be steady, each evening he'd chosen to be honest, each moment he'd seen her flinch or retreat and chosen patience over the easier response of taking it personally. He wasn't always good at it. There were evenings he'd been too quiet when words would have helped, days he'd moved too fast and seen her close off and had to back up and recalibrate. He was not, as he'd told her, good at this. But he was here. That was the thing he'd gotten right, and right that he hadn't always gotten right in his life. He was here, and he was staying, and that turned out to matter more than doing it gracefully. Outside, the March wind ran over Granite Ridge with the same indifference it had always had. The mountain didn't care about the people on it. It never had, and it never would. And that was in its way a comfort. The world wasn't organized around human pain, which meant it also wasn't organized against human hope. Things happened on the mountain because that was what things did. Two people ended up in a cabin together and built something out of necessity and winter and honesty and time. And the mountain neither helped nor hindered. It just held them up, the way ground does, without asking anything in return. Spring was still weeks away. There was wood to cut and animals to tend and a fence that needed real attention before the thaw made the ground workable, and a roof repair that had been deferred too long, and a trip to Millhaven for supplies, and a letter to write to Garrett confirming the deed registration and closing off the one legal angle she'd identified as not yet fully addressed. There was all of that. The work didn't stop because the crisis had passed. Out here, the work never stopped, and that had always been its own kind of truth. The mountain taught you that life was not made of moments, it was made of days, and the days were made of work. And if you were paying attention, somewhere inside all that ordinary effort, the real things grew. He banked the fire. He went to sleep. And in the back room, in the dark, a woman who had once hidden a deed in her shoe to keep it safe lay with one hand resting open on the blanket beside her, not reaching for any bolt, not counting exits, not running the calculation of who was outside and what they wanted. Just breathing, just here. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that was enough, more than enough. It was in fact everything. The ordinary, unguarded, unhurried fact of being somewhere she had chosen, beside someone who had chosen her back. With her name on the land and the door unlocked in the morning, whatever it brought, still hours away and unhurried. She wasn't done healing. She knew that. She was going to keep checking, the way she'd written. But she was also going to keep choosing this. The fire in the next room, the horses in the stable, the sound of the mountain working its way toward a spring it would eventually, in its own time, allow. Some things you build fast because you have to. Some things you build slow because they're worth it. This was the second kind.